Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today this is the 6th episode of the series where I teach you guys GraphQL from the beginning. And in this video, we're actually going to start transitioning into creating a full stack application. So we've dealt a lot with backend stuff. We kind of know how type definitions work. We understand how queries and mutations work. We understand how resolvers work, and it's all chill. But the thing is, the whole point of GraphQL is to facilitate how the front end is able to query and handle data from the backend. So it is important for us to just start working on the front end so that you guys can get introduced to that topic. And if I need to introduce new topics from the backend, I'll just introduce them after we already have a front end. So in this video, we're going to create a new folder over here, and it's going to be called the client folder, like this. And this client folder will include everything related to the front end, similar to how the server folder includes everything related to the backend. So I'm just going to open this up over here. This terminal is in the backend and it's running our server. I'm going to open another terminal and change my directory to be the client folder, like this. You can see it's the client folder. And I just want to install a simple React application into this project. And to do that, I'm going to run the command npx create React app, like this, and then a dot at the end, which basically means that I want to create my React application inside of the client folder. Now, what we're going to be using as our communication library to use GraphQL in our front end, it's going to be called the Apollo client library. I'm going to show you guys this over here, Apollo client. This is it's probably the most famous front-end GraphQL library out there, especially for React, and it allows you to do so many things. You can just look over here and see how you can write the syntax and how everything works. But we're going to be using this throughout our project, and it's used in many companies, so I feel like it's a good learning experience. So as you can see over here, it has finished just creating our front end. We have this simple React application over here. I'm just going to close the backend stuff because we're going to focus on the front end. And what I like to do whenever I start a React project, as many of you guys might know, is I like to delete the test file, the index.css file, the logo, and the test file, because we're not going to use any of them. So I'm just going to delete all of them like this. And now let's come to our index.js, delete the import for the CSS file we just deleted, and then come to our app.js and just delete the logo over here and also all of this stuff over here because we're really not going to use it. Now let's just write over here hello world and try to run this application by coming over here and saying npm start. When we run this, it should run and open it over here, and it should be an empty screen, an empty white screen with hello world written in the middle of it. So let's see. You can see, yeah, this is exactly what happens. I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so that everything becomes clearer. And what we want to build is, we really don't care about what our front end is. We just want to be able to fetch data and create data, right? So the first thing I want to be able to do is fetch data. So over here in our fake data, we have a list of users and we have a list of movies. And in our schema, if we see over here, we have two query types. We can get a full list of all the users. We can get a specific user, we can get a full list of movies, and we can get a specific movie. I'm going to show you guys how to do each of them respectively in their own. But the first one we're going to work on is how to fetch lists of users, right, or a list of movies. We can do both of them, but it's going to be pretty similar, so it's totally fine. So to do that, we actually need to tell our React application that it's going to accept and it's going to make a connection to a GraphQL API, so that whenever we make an API request, it is using all the GraphQL standard methods to make that request and fetch that data. So in order to do that, we're going to come over here to our highest level component, which is the app.js. And inside of this, what we want to do is we want to initialize first by importing some stuff from the Apollo client library. Now, as you can see over here, we haven't installed Apollo client, so we need to do that right now. So I'm just going to open another terminal over here, and let's clear this terminal. Let's go into the client folder, like this, and let's start installing all the packages we need. So technically, the only library we actually need is the Apollo client library. And by the way, this is Apollo client version 3. it was very different the way you did all of this stuff, including like how you import the name of the libraries and everything from previous versions. So keep in mind that this is the most updated version of GraphQL, or not GraphQL, but the Apollo client library. So just keep that in mind. So I'm just gonna come over here and say npm install, and I want to install the library at Apollo/client. And this library over here is the one that is going to control our whole frontend and make it work with our GraphQL API. Now, as you can see over here, I pressed enter and it's installing everything, and it seemed like our library just finished installing. So what we want to do is we're going to come here at the top and we want to try to import from at Apollo client again, and you can see that our thing actually autocompletes, which means the package is installed. Now, what we want to import from the Apollo client library is the following. We first want to import an Apollo client like this. It's a class that is created by the Apollo client library. Then we also want to import something called in-memory cache, which is also a library, and I'll explain a little bit later. And then we want to import Apollo provider, which is also a class that comes from the Apollo client library. What we need to do is this Apollo client over here, this class, it basically, whenever you create a new instance of it, you're telling GraphQL that you want to use this to connect to an API. So for a connection, you need an Apollo client an Apollo client object or a class instantiated. So to do that, we'll just come over here and we'll just say create a variable called client and set it equal to a new version or a new instance of the Apollo client class, like this. And this class takes in a few arguments. And the way we pass it in is as an object like this. And the two arguments that it takes in is basically the first one, some sort of cache that we need to specify, and I'll go over this in a bit. And also a URI, which is basically the link, the URL to where your GraphQL API is running. So if you're using a public API, you can just put it over here. But if we're using our own API, for us, it's basically just http:/localhost 3001, because that's where our API is running. And this should tell GraphQL that this is where our API is running, which means that it's going to actually connect to our API and make it work. So I also need to put the /GraphQL, because if you recall, GraphQL always runs on the /GraphQL endpoint, so we need to specify which one it is so that our library understands what it's doing. Then for cache, what happens is the Apollo client library has a really good state management aspect to it, and it allows you as well to cache information and data into your browser, right? So basically, if you fetch some data and you change a component, for example, move in your route system, and you go back, you want the data to be kind of updated, right? Or you might want the data to be the same thing. You don't want to need to refresh the page every time you move. Because think about it this way: if you render a component and you go back to another component, making a request every time you render a component might be overkill. And if you want, you can just cache your data, and the data will maintain the same because probably there weren't any changes to the data to begin with. So this is basically what cache is in GraphQL. And with GraphQL, with the Apollo client library, they have an option which is basically just determining that your cache is in memory, which means it's gonna literally save that information or cache the data in memory. So we'll just say that our cache system will be in memory cache, and we can just declare it like this, and GraphQL will know exactly what to do. So now that we have this client variable over here, we basically just declared how our structure of our API will be and what API we're communicating with. Now what we need to do is we need to wrap all of our components that should be able to make a request to GraphQL with an Apollo provider component. So I'm just going to say Apollo provider over here and just wrap it around with the highest level component, and just wrap everything around with it like this. And on the top over here, we need to pass and specify a client, because it takes a client as a prop, and the client that we want to pass is this client that we created over here. So I'm just going to paste it inside of here. And now what should happen is we should establish a connection with our GraphQL API, and our project is kind of ready to start making API requests to our GraphQL API. So now that we have created this, let's actually start by making our project be able to accept such requests, right? So what we want is over here, I just want to have a div, right? And I just want to say something like, have an h1 which says list of users, and I want to fetch the data and then just display the list of users below this. So right now all we have is this thing saying list of users, but it's totally fine. I'll show you guys how to fetch the data now. So what we want to do is we want to import some stuff from the Apollo client library. So the first thing I want to import is I want to import the useQuery hook. Now, what is useQuery? Well, the useQuery hook is extremely important for the Apollo client library because it is the hook you use to make queries to your API. Similar to that, there is a use mutation hook which allows you to make call mutations into your API. There's other hooks as well, and you should definitely learn them. I'm going to show you guys one of them, which is the useLazyQuery hook, which is also very important. But for now, let's just focus on useQuery. Basically, what useQuery does is it fetches some data from an API, and it does it whenever the component renders. So in our case, whenever this component over here renders, we should see the data being displayed immediately without us having to call any action or doing anything like that. So to use the useQuery hook, we'll just come down here at the bottom inside of our app component. And actually what I want to do is I want to create another component to fetch all the data. So I'm just going to call this display data. The reason why I want to do it is because I don't want to like put everything into a single file and make it confusing. So I'm actually going to just import the useQuery over here at the top, and I just want to come over here and just render the display data component like this, and you see it was automatically imported, so it's totally fine. In our display data over here, I want to import from the Apollo client library. So from Apollo client, I want to import the useQuery hook, and inside of here I just want to say const then I want to open and close and say useQuery. And what we pass over here is the query that we want to make. Now, what I want to tell you guys is it's a bit confusing. If you recall in the second episode of this series, I showed you guys how to fetch data from the front end whenever you don't you just have an API and you want to fetch data. And throughout the series, we've been using the Apollo library, which I'll just show you guys over here, localhost 4000, which is actually, oh, I just realized our API is running on localhost 4000, so I need to change this over here to be 4000 and not 3001. I'm sorry about that, so I'm just gonna say 4000. Throughout the series, we've been querying data and fetching data using this sandbox, right? So to query data, we just say something like this, and it gets us all the data. Well, it's basically what we need to do right now, because we are now fetching the data from the front end. So to do that, we need to write some GraphQL similar to this over here to specify what we want to query. Now to do that, we create something called a GQL statement. So we need to import something called GQL from here. And to create a GQL statement, all we do is we come over here, we say const, then the name of our statement, which by standard it's usually something like query all users, like this. And by the way, I'm not really sure why we use all capital letters. I've just always seen it like this, and I'm not completely sure why this is a standard, but feel free to do something different. I always do it like this, so I don't know why, but yeah, that's the thing. You say you call it query all users, you set it equal to GQL, and then you open and close backticks like this, and you write GQL code inside of here, similar to what we've been doing in our type definitions over here, as you can see. So what we write over here is exactly what we wrote over here to query all users. We just copy and paste it over here, as you can see, and we just specify, okay, I want literally to query all users, so I need to specify which field from our root query we want to get. In our case, it is the users field, because it is the field that we want to query. And we also specify what fields inside of the user type we want to get. So we can get an ID, an age, a username, and a name. Now, it is very similar to what we've been doing. So when you finish this over here and you create this query, you basically just come over here, you copy this, paste it over here, and it will make the request. Now, how do we get the data? How do we know if the data, like if it failed, if there was any errors, that kind of stuff? Well, the GraphQL, the Apollo client library, allows you to get all of that information very easily by using the useQuery hook. For example, if I want to get the data, I can just get the data out of it, and this data variable over here should display the data. So let's actually test it out. Let's say if data, so if we have the data, then I want to console log the data. Let's see if this will work. Now, if I come over here and I just refresh my page, let's open the console as well. If I just refresh my page, should we see the data? And yeah, we see the data. So you see, it console log the data, it console log the field users, and each user is included over here, which means that our API and our frontend are correctly connected, and we're able to see all the information that we're sending from our backend. So this is amazing. It means everything is working, and it means that we can continue just building more stuff. So what else can we do with this useQuery hook? Well, we can also get information, for example, if the data is loading. So if the data is loading, maybe we want to display something like this. Instead of returning the data down here, we can return an h1 tag saying data is loading. And you'll see that whenever I refresh the page, for a split second, it will say data is loading, because it is, while the data is loading, while it's fetching the data, it should display this information, which is really cool, and it's a really great addition from the Apollo client library. Now, in this case, what you might want to use is like a loading spinner or a loading bar or something like that. But for me, I'll just leave it like this, and it's totally fine. We can also get any errors that might occur by just grabbing the error variable over here. And what you can do is you can do something like this. You can say if error, then you maybe just some error handling, or just display something saying, oh, some error occurred. For me, I'll just console log the error just to see what happened. And I don't think any errors are happening, so that's totally fine. But the important thing is that we now have the data available for us. So how do we display this data? It's a list of users. So what we can do is, inside of our return statement down here, where we're just like returning UI stuff, we can just come and say, I want to, if the data is available first, because remember, for a split second, data might not be available because it's still fetching. So we always need to ask if the data is available. Then I want to map through the data like this, data.map. And inside of this, I just want to create a function which basically says that whenever, for each element in data, I want to return over here an h1 tag saying, actually I'll return a div just so we can actually display a lot of information. So I'll say I want to return a div, and this div will include the following. It will include an h1 tag that says name is equal to, and then we need to grab each item. So I'm going to say user over here, and I want to say that the name is equal to user.name, because it is one of the fields that we're querying, right? We're grabbing the name, we're grabbing the age and the username. Then I want to do the exact same thing, but for the age and the username, which are the other two things that we want. So I'll just grab over here the username, user.username, like this. And we'll do the same thing for the age and say user.age. And you should see that now it should be displaying, but it isn't. It is saying that data.map is not a function, which is kind of interesting. And I know why this is happening, but if we recall in our console log, I don't know if I deleted the console log. I did, but basically in our console log over here, I'll just do it again like this. If data is equal to data, let's just console log data. Look at what happens. It will basically just the data that we're receiving isn't just an array. It's an object containing a field called user and then an array of the data. So instead of saying that we want to map through data like this, we want to say data.users or user. Let me see which one it is. It's users.map, because we want to specify which field from the data has the data that we want. So now it should be working. You can see that it is actually console logging each user with its name, its username, and its age, which is amazing, right? It's working perfectly. Now we can specify more fields if we want to. For example, if you recall, in our user type there is nationality, so I can just come over here and say nationality like this, and we can add a new field over here, which for some reason should show the nationality. Let's see if this works. Nationality and user.nationality. And you should see that each user should contain a nationality below them, which is really cool as well. You can specify everything you get from the backend right from the frontend, which is the whole point of GraphQL, right? So now that we know how to do this, now that we are able to query our data, let's add another one really quick, just so that we can use what we just practiced and be able to query movies. Try to do this without me showing. I'll just show right now, but try to pause the video and try to do it on your own. Let's try to query this field over here. Where is it? It's over here, the movies field, and let's see if it works. So for us, it's going to be very simple. All we're going to do is we're going to come over here. We're going to create a new GQL statement. Let's say query all movies like this. And then instead of get all users, let's just call this get all movies. And we can just specify that we want to grab the movies like field from our API, and it will return a list of movies. So each movie can have a name, a year of publication, and an is in theaters Boolean. So I'll just grab the name of the movie for simplicity reasons. So I'll literally just grab the name over here. And what we do now is we just create a new useQuery hook. And instead of passing the query all users, we pass the query all movies. Now, one thing you might wonder is, okay, but these variables all have the same name. So what do I do now? A very common thing to do is just give them different names. And to give different names, all you have to do is you see this data over here, right? This is a variable called data. If I want to change it to movie data, I can just put a colon over here and change it to movie data. And now the same data will be in this variable. I'm going to do the exact same thing for this over here, movie loading. Actually, I won't show any loading and error. I just want to grab the data. And for movie data, I'll just come down here at the bottom, below the data that we're mapping over here, and I'll do the exact same thing. I'll just say movie data. If it's true, then I want to say movie data dot movies, because we need to access the movies field from the query type, and then I want to map through them. And for each movie, I want to just return an h1 tag with the movie name. So I'll just say name or movie name, something like this. Movie name is equal to movie.name. And now you should see that at the bottom over here, right below all the users, we should get all the movies in our data set, which is amazing. It means everything is working. Now we've done a lot of stuff. We've actually worked with just querying a list of stuff that we have in our API. How do we actually just query stuff individually? So we have these types over here, for example, where we pass an ID and we can query a specific movie or a specific user. But how do we specify and how do we actually query information based on an action, right? Because right now we're just making a query and fetching data whenever we refresh our page or our component is rendered. But how do we fetch data on command or on click? Well, to do that, I'm gonna create a new component over here. Or actually, no, I'll just do it down here at the bottom. I'll create a div over here, and I'll just put an input. And this input over here will be of type text, like this. And it will contain the movie name that we want to search for. So for example, I can just go over here and say something like placeholder, and I just want to specify something like Interstellar, just to give an example of how you write a movie name, like this. And then down here at the bottom, let's just add a button, which when you click on this button, it's supposed to make a request and fetch the data from this movie that we wrote over here. And I want to just display the data down here by creating a div, and then we're going to display the data that we receive inside of here. Now, how do we do this? How do we fetch data on command? Well, the first thing we need is the actual whatever the user wrote over here. So how do we grab values for inputs? Well, it's very simple. We need to basically just create a state. So I'll create a state over here at the top, and I'll create the state and call it movie searched, or set movie searched, something like this. And this will be equal to the use state hook, like this. And we need to import it. It was actually automatically imported, so it's fine. And this over here should be a string and should start as an empty string. Now what we do is we just come over here to our input and we say that whenever there's any change to our input, we want to detect that change, grab the event, and for each event, for each change, we want to set the movie search to be equal to event.target.value. And this will alter the value of the movie search state to be equal to whatever we wrote in this input over here, which means that I can just write interstellar, and now the state is, like the value of the state is interstellar, which is great because it's what we want to search for. So now what we do is we come over here at the top and we want to import another hook from the Apollo client library, and this hook is called the useLazyQuery hook. And LazyQuery just means that we want to hook for data like on command, right? We want to only want to fetch the data whenever we tell it to fetch. And it's very similar to the useQuery hook. We just come here at the bottom, we say something like const, then we open and close brackets instead of curly braces like this. We set it equal to the useLazyQuery hook, and we do need to pass a query over here, which I'll do in a second. But what happens here is you can grab information from the query like this over here. But first you need to define the name of a function which we're going to use to call to fetch the data. So for example, if I want to fetch this data, let's give a name for a function that would do that. Let's call it fetch movie. And then over here we can do the same thing we did over here. So we need to first pass the name of the function and then what we want to grab from the data. So I can grab the data, I can get any errors, and those are the two that I really want to do for this one. So I'll call this I don't know, movie search data, and I'll call this movie error like this. And this function will pass it down here at the bottom, so that whenever we click on this button, so we'll pass an on click, we want to call the fetch movie function. And it's that simple. You just basically specify a name of a function which you want to call to fetch this data, and you can call this how many times you want and it will fetch the data every single time. So this is basically it for the useLazyQuery hook for setting it up. Now we need to write our query that it's going to be used to fetch the data. So for getting a movie, it's a bit different from this one's over here, because if you recall, we need a variable, right? We have a variable over here, which is the movie name that we need to pass. So we need to specify that whenever we write our query over here. So I'm just gonna say query, and then I want to say get movie by name, like this. Oh, I completely forgot to that this is not query, this is const. And I want to specify it like this and set this equal to GQL, and let's open and close backticks. And now what we want to do over here is we want to write a query similar to what we've been doing like over here, where we specify a variable, we give it its type, and then over here we just use that variable and pass the value over here. So to do that, we'll just come over here and say we want to query and give it a name. Let's say get movie by name, similar to what we wrote above. But then we need to pass parentheses to say that we need to pass an argument or variables to this function. So similar to this, we declare a variable name by adding like a money sign. So I'll just say money sign, let's call this name, and give it a type, so it's going to be of type string. Then over here we call the type that we want to query, which in our case it will be the movie type over here. And when we query the movie type, we specify that we want our name arguments, or our name variable over here, to be equal to whichever variable we pass to this query. So we'll just say money sign name. Now I know 100% that this is confusing, and it is very confusing in the beginning, but just continue practicing on this. Just keep making more queries and working on more examples, and it will make sense. Basically what we're doing is we need to first define a variable name over here, give it its type, and then when you query the field, you pass the variable that you defined over here to its value. And the reason why we do this is because we need to pass the value of this variable from outside of this query. We really want to do this, right? We want to set the name of the movie we're searching to this state over here. So how can we do that if the query is predefined over here? We couldn't just come over here and set something like the name should be Interstellar. We want to actually make this be dynamic, and the name that is searched is the name that we want to search and that the user is actually trying to search. So to do that, we need to do it like this. And we then just specify which fields from the movie type we want to get. Now we remember that the movie type includes this fields over here. So I want to grab the name and the year of publication for simplicity reasons. So I'll just say name and year of publication, like this. Now this is fine over here. I think this query should work. Let's just copy the get movie by name, paste it into our useLazyQuery, and now it knows exactly what it needs to, or what it's supposed to fetch. So what we want to do is we want to use this data variable over here, down here at the bottom, and like right over here. And we want, whenever we get the data, so if data, or actually it's not data, it's movie searched data. So whenever movie search data is equal to true, then we want to just display an h1 tag. Actually, let's display a div like this, and this div should include the data that we want, and the data that we want is an h1 tag including the movie name, and the movie name will be equal to movie search data dot movie, because movie is the field that we're querying, dot name, like this. And we'll do the same thing for the other one, which is the year of publication. So year of publication, like this, and we'll say movie search data dot movie dot year of publication. And now when we save this, it should not be working. It is not displayed. Even if we click on this over here, it will fail. And the reason why it will fail is because we're actually not passing the variable, so the movie name, to the request that we're making over here. Now, how do we do this? How do we pass this movie search state over here as the variable for this, so that it is actually querying the correct movie? Well, there's two ways to do this. You can either pass it over here by just saying, just opening an object and saying variables like this and just passing the data, but I usually like to pass it through the function. So there's this function over here called fetch movie, and instead of just saying on click fetch movie, we want to say that on click we want to call the fetch movie function with the following arguments. So I want to pass a variables property over here, and for the variables we open and close curly braces to define that there might be multiple variables that we're trying to pass to our query, and we just specify which variables we want. In our case, we want a variable called name, and the value of it will be movie searched, the movie search state. Now we're actually fetching the correct movie depending on what we wrote on this input. One thing that I just realized as well that I need to fix is, I mentioned this in the first or second video. When you have something like this over here, where we're using variables like this, the name actually matters. If you're going to give a name to this, it needs to be either like empty or just the name of the field. So in this case, it's movie with a capital letter. So something like this. And now what we can do is we can just come over here and try to test to see if it's working. So let's just come down here and search for Interstellar like this. And when we click fetch data, you can see that it opens up a little bit more space because now it shows the data for the movie we searched. Now, one thing that is important to understand is if I try to search for something that isn't a movie, it will break. You can see it doesn't show the data, but we do want to see what the error was. Obviously, the error was caused because we try to search for a movie that doesn't exist. So what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if this movie error variable over here exists, and if it does, I just want to console log it. So let me say if movie error exists. then I want to just console log it. And also, I'm going to console log the movie error like this. And also, maybe do some UI error handling. Like, if this is not true, like if this is true, we want to display this. But if movie error is true, then I want to display an h1 tag saying something like, there was an error fetching the data. And when I save this, you can see that if I refresh my page and I try to search for something like Interstellar, we should see that it will work. But if I try searching for something like whatever this is, it should say there was an error fetching the data. And if we go to our console, it should actually console log some sort of predefined GraphQL error, which is this one over here. It basically just says cannot return null for non-nullable fields. So we tried to query a movie, but it didn't actually return the movie. That's what it's basically saying. So now we have our beautiful app over here, which I honestly looking right now, it kind of seems confusing, but we're able to query data from lists. We're able to fetch data from a specific, like from one single user using variables when we're querying data. And that's amazing. By the way, if you were to use variables like we used here for the useLazyQuery, instead of just but you want to do it for the useQuery, for example, instead of passing this data like inside of the function like we did over here,